Hi, guys. Welcome to our next lesson. So, we're going to be continuing our lesson on the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, right? And so, we're really looking at this essential question. We're trying to answer this in this lesson, and it's how did the ideas of the Enlightenment lead to the independence and founding of the United States? So, we're going to talk about the war now. We're going to go briefly into the war for independence. I'm not going to go into a lot of the military activities or even a lot of the political machinations that were going on during the war, but we are going to kind of go through how the war is won. So the fighting begins in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord. These were two places where the British came out to seize American militia arms, right? They wanted to seize their weapons. And the British actually defeat the militia at both Lexington and Concord, and they march back to Boston. And on the way back to on the way back, the British are forced into Boston, where they can't leave anymore. So they're kept in Boston, and the Americans occupy several hills around Boston to oversee what the British are doing in the town. And at one point, the British try to force them off a hill. They mistakenly believed it to be Bunker Hill. It's actually Breed's Hill in Boston, and the British forced them off Bunker Hill at this battle. But the British lose hundreds of men with thousands wounded. The Americans retreat, but they hold on for a while, and it kind of at this point goes to show that the Americans are not going to get pushed over that easily, right? So the British at this point thought that they would have to maybe conduct a few battles, show off a little bit, maybe just kind of make a show of force. But the reality is that the Americans are in it for the long haul. Um, I mean, this battle, Bunker Hill especially, shows that the Americans are not going to get pushed around that easily. So we talked about the first Continental Congress in our previous lesson already, but now the second Continental Congress is kind of the important one. Uh, this Congress, this group, they meet following the actions at Lexington and Concord. And at that point, the colonies decide that there's going to be a continental effort. There's going to be some kind of supra-colonial effort, all of the colonies working together. And they pick George Washington to be the commander of the Continental Army. And George Washington was a Virginian, which was really important because the fighting was mostly in Massachusetts so far, right? And they don't want to appoint just another person from New England and from Massachusetts. Instead, they want to appoint someone from another part of America to show this is not just a Massachusetts problem, it's really an American problem. So they pick a Virginian, George Washington. And George Washington was one of those people who had major military experience. He had been a colonel in the militia. He had fought in the 7 Years' War. He was trained with the British Army. So he was a soldier that most Americans were aware of at the time. Second thing they do is they assigned Thomas Jefferson to write a Declaration of Independence that will formally and legally separate the American colonies from Britain. This will be important because it's going to have a lot of the Enlightenment ideals that we're going to talk about. So I really hate to just do the entire American Revolution in a few bullet points, but we're going to do it. So the war goes on for a very long time, right? It's a very long war in terms of casualties. It's probably America's bloodiest war we had in terms of how many people we had living at the time. Very, very bloody. Lots of horrible battles, atrocities on both sides. And the Americans lose the vast majority of the battles. But Washington's genius is that he's able to hold together the army even though they're continually losing. Um, he has like minor victories along the way. They really serve to show that they just have to hang in there long enough. They just have to do what modern day guerrilla fighters do, which is guerrilla with a GUE, not a GOR, and they have to just not lose. They have to hang in there and fight at times when they had the advantage, and that's what the Americans do. They hang in long enough just to force the British out of the fight. And they also are able to get French support. So they win a battle at Saratoga in 1777 when the French can see that, maybe the Americans are worth supporting after they win this battle. maybe they can hang in there, you know? So the French are really a major reason why the Americans win, which is going to be very important for the French down the road. The amount of money and supplies and men that they send to America is going to lead them to revolution. But for our purposes right now, French support during the war means that the Americans have an ally that is going to help them turn the war from a local problem for the British into now a world contest. Um, the French are going to begin fighting the British at sea, in the Caribbean, in Europe, and all over the place. So the British are going to have to pull forces away from America and fight the French elsewhere. The French are also going to get the Spanish Empire to join them, so that the Spanish are going to be fighting the British as well. And eventually the Dutch are going to be supplying the Americans. So eventually it's going to be the Americans and French mostly on the ground fighting against the British, being aided by the Spanish at sea, and the Dutch financially are supporting. So the British are going to really have their hands full quite a bit during the war. And the war will end in 1781. The fighting will end in 1781 with the American French victory at Yorktown, the Battle of Yorktown. And then over a couple years, they negotiate a peace treaty, which culminates with the independence of America ratified by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So let's take a look at the document that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1776. So remember, he's asked by the Second Continental Congress to draft a Declaration of Independence. And I think it's important. This is just a minor thing, but I'm sure they're going to talk about it in more detail maybe another time. So the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, uh, you know, it's important to remember that uh, they didn't capitalize United initially in the original Declaration of Independence, simply just to denote that this wasn't going to be the name of the country. That's not what they thought that the name of the country was going to be. They didn't think it was going to be United States. Instead, they used the term United States of America simply just to denote that these were states in America that for the moment were fighting the British, and they just happened to be united at the time. So try to keep that in mind. That's something kind of just little fact. It's kind of important. Now, that of course is the name of our country today, the United States. But from their perspective, that's not what they were doing. They weren't making the name of the country the United States. So, the Declaration of Independence, it's written by Thomas Jefferson, and you can just tell by looking at it that Jefferson is really a big reader in John Locke. And these were ideas that were permeating American society, especially for the middle class, which Thomas Jefferson came from, although he was actually upper middle class. But he was well educated, well informed, read a lot of books on the Enlightenment. And so in the Declaration, he writes of natural rights, the same natural rights that John Locke writes of. So John Locke wrote of life, liberty, and property. Jefferson writes of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we can see there's that similarity right there, that they're pulling from this idea that all people have these rights, and that's why they're worth protecting. And so he declares also in the Declaration of Independence the right to abolish unjust government. And then he goes on to prove that the British government under King George III is unjust. And he lists a series of grievances against them and says, this is why the Americans need to revolt. And he also goes on to demand the right to representation, which he says the king has denied to the colonists, and that Parliament is not taking into account American preferences. And so the Americans have a right to rebel, which is a very important thing. And even some Americans today believe that they have a fundamental right to rebel against government. And part of it is because of this argument that Jefferson makes in the Declaration of Independence. But Jefferson's perspective here, he says that they have a right to representation, what they called at that time popular sovereignty. This is an important term to remember, so write this down. Popular sovereignty, or it means the will of the people. So the Americans and the founders especially were not fond of democracy in the sense that they did not want people to be voting specifically for individual things. Remember what a direct democracy is from our unit on Greece, right? So the founders did not want that kind of direct democracy here in America. They wanted people to pick their leaders who would then pick and choose amongst a series of choices, right? And so it's a couple steps removed from democracy. So it's democratic, but it's a republican form of government, kind of like what we learned about in Rome. Now, the downside of the Declaration is that it's very hypocritical. To the modern ear, to whenever we read it or we hear it, when Jefferson writes about all men being created equal, uh, that's not necessarily what he meant. It's not as straightforward. He literally means men in this situation, in this context. He literally means white landowning men. So he is in the Enlightenment time. He's not democratic. He's not saying all people. He's not even saying all men. He's saying men of a certain intellectual persuasion. So he's classically liberal. He's not democratic. He's classically liberal in the sense that he wants the welfare of the people to be the foremost concern for government. But he doesn't trust the people themselves or women or Africans to make those choices for themselves. Um, so he wants to have a layer of people in between that, and that will be an important thing that we look at in the Constitution. So uh, a, a declaration is very much the Declaration of Independence is very much an Enlightenment document based upon Enlightenment ideas. The American Republic. So America is a republic. It doesn't have a king. It's chosen by the people. That's important to remember. The first words of the Constitution are "We the people," and that's where sovereignty lies in America. Remember, popular sovereignty. So the American founders, from the very beginning, they're very aware that everything they're doing is brand new, and in many ways that's good for them because they're taking the old system and they're not throwing it all away. Some traditions do remain, but they're very conscious of picking and choosing what of the past do they want to keep and what do they want to change. And so they're looking at the Enlightenment philosophers for answers on how do you create a government. If you could create any government overnight, like how would you change it? If you could do anything brand new, what would it look like, right? So they're looking to the Enlightenment philosophers to answer those questions. And so I would argue that the two major people who had a say in how the Constitution was constructed were James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Both of them are bringing books from Rousseau and John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu, like we've talked about, and they're studying these things. And James Madison very famously did this very long historical study on Switzerland and how individual cantons in Switzerland govern themselves democratically, but also they were respecting the rights of minorities and minority opinion and avoiding the rule of the many over the few. And so these guys are very aware that they are doing something historic at this time. So they know that, in the words of the Hamilton musical, the eyes of history are on them, right? If you've ever seen that, it's on Disney Plus. Go watch it if you haven't. So they're aware of this. They're aware that the eyes of the history are on them and that they're going to be looked at for what's going to happen next. So they know they're making a new system of government and they get all these ideas from different places. We the people being the source of sovereignty, comes directly from Jean-Jacques Rousseau with the social contract. Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu, has this idea of a separation of powers. He doesn't want individual people to hold too much authority in a political system. So he famously says that the legislature and the executive should not share power because that creates a tyranny. And so, very famously, in the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution dictates the powers of Congress, the legislative branch, along with Article 2, the executive branch, the presidency, being a separate person with separate powers, and both can check the authority of the other, right? So, if you've seen this before, you've probably studied it in eighth grade a little bit. You have a separation of powers with each branch of government having um, their own responsibilities and powers. So the president can veto any law passed by Congress, but then Congress can override that veto with a supermajority of 2/3. And even the Supreme Court, the judiciary or the judicial branch, they can override what the Congress and the president passed by making it or declaring it unconstitutional. So there are a number of things that prevent any one branch from getting too much power, right? They don't oppose the idea of governmental authority. What they oppose is absolutism. They want there to be many different ways in which different levers of power can be used to make sure that no one group or no one person in this political system has too much power. And it's in complete opposition to the absolutism we have looked at in our previous lessons. If we look at absolute monarchs like Frederick the Great or Louis XIV or Catherine the Great, they're specifically saying that their authority is the only authority that matters, and they're the only ones that should have any say regarding what happens, right? So the American Constitution is created specifically with the opposite in mind, to separate powers and to make sure that it's going to be tough to get things done, right? And the last part of the federal system allows for every individual state to have a lot of power individually. So again, even with the federal system, the idea that the federal government has some power, but the state governments have different powers, that's going to be important for a dividing of power, right? And the Bill of Rights is also going to be created. When some people argue that there has to be a written set of what rights are allowed and what those natural rights are of all Americans. And we know those rights, right? It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and we call them the Bill of Rights. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a jury trial, not to be tortured, right to bear arms. So it's a matter of interpretation as to what these mean in the modern day, but it should be pointed out that John Locke was talking about natural rights during the Enlightenment, and the Americans believed this to be such a fundamental idea that they took those natural rights spoken about by John Locke and they delineate exactly what they are so that they can say these are natural rights, that no government can take away these rights, and these are sacrosanct. They're given to you by the Creator. They are inalienable, meaning they cannot be taken away. And so that's why they're laid out in the Bill of Rights. And lastly, the American Republic, the creation of it, and its revolt against Britain, which was a colonial authority, it's going to be emulated. It's going to become a symbol. France is going to have a revolution. We'll get into that later on, as well as Haiti and Latin American countries who are going to overthrow their rulers. Haiti will revolt against France, and Latin American revolutions, the revolutions fought by Simón Bolívar, will overthrow Spain. And they're all going to follow this American model for good or bad. We'll see how it goes. But probably the most successful revolution of them all, because it incorporates so many Enlightenment ideas, is the American Revolution. But it's important to remember that the American Revolution isn't just an American event. It's an event that takes place in world history. And so it does influence other nations, right? And that's an important thing to remember. And that's going to be it for the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. So now we're going to take to listen to a speech given by John Adams. Of course, it's not the real John Adams, right? They didn't have video back then. But it's from this very famous HBO movie that basically documented his life and what it was like. And so we're going to listen to a little bit of his speech, one of his most famous speeches.
From our Committee of Correspondence in Virginia, we hear that the House of Burgesses has selected deputies to join the great Continental Congress. We have heard tonight from our own representatives to Congress, convening in Philadelphia, Mr. John Hancock, Mr. Robert Treat Paine, and Mr. Elbert Garrett. I give you now a new delegate from Massachusetts, a man whose prudence and probity are well known to you all. Mr. John Adams.
Let it be known
Let it be known that British liberties are not the grants of princes or parliaments.
that many of our rights are inherent and essential, agreed on as maxims and established as preliminaries even before Parliament existed. We have a right to them, derived from our Maker. Our forefathers have earned and bought liberty for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasures, and their blood.
Liberty is not built on the doctrine that a few nobles have a right to inherit the earth. No! No!
It stands on this principle that the meanest and lowest of the people are, by the unalterable, indefeasible laws of God and nature, as well entitled to the benefit of the air to breathe, light to see, food to eat, and clothes to wear as the nobles or the king. That is liberty. And liberty will reign in America.